I guess it's a sort of vanity, but I consider myself to be the most fortunate of all church persons here, as I'm chairing the concluding session with Rivka. For one thing, I'm relieved from the burden of introducing the speaker, as each of the sessions here, each of the papers actually, we introduced and represented Rivkas for us new. And each of the papers conducted a dialogue, I think, with one or two aspects of a diverse intellectual pursuit, which is coming to think about it again in the last 2 days. It's great, it's vast. Just to think of them, perhaps the main path of intellectual endeavor, from the technicalities, almost esoteric field of early modern mechanics, to Galileo science, to Galileo and the church, to Jesuit science, actually Jesuit culture, and then to the greater questions of the nature of the Baroque period, of the scientific evolution, and up to the greatest question of the humanities, of modernity, secularization, or shall we say religion versus the secular. This is, as I said, only one path. Perhaps it's the main one, but only one path of many other intellectual achievements of Rivka. Just coming to mind is the immigration of knowledge, immigration of Russians to Israel, genealogy and theory of the humanities, Amalia Kahana-Carmon, the Israeli writer which Rivka wrote about, Julia Kristeva, and many other things. The papers also remind us, and everybody actually mentioned it explicitly, about Rivka profound influence Rivka had and still has on students and colleagues alike. What the paper did not tell, but it came up in some of the speakers, is Rivka's personality, and I think we should mention it for the record, to mention Rivka's generosity and kindness and care and uncompromising commitment to everybody, and especially to students who needs it more than others, more than colleagues, must be said. So instead of reciting this or that title in this or that journal, I think on behalf of everybody here, I'll just thank Rivka personally, intellectually, for what she is, what she's done. And I remind her that retirement is only institutional term. And even this is partial, giving the Minerva Center and other things that pop up, that always pop up. And personally, intellectually, we expect you to be more present than ever, now that you are relieved of the burden of teaching. So Rivka, we invite you to inspire us and excite us and fascinate us again.
So, can you hear me? Since I don't have a PowerPoint, I will just speak from here and make my best to be heard. Modernity. What is it, in fact? A word, a term, a concept, an historical entity? Clearly, it is a signifier capable of producing a rich discourse on the past, yet relevant for the present. Such discourse has been evolving here among us in these last 2 days like a musical theme with variations, diffusing its spirit while also circulating its specters, the ghosts embedded in the big topics of our lives as intellectuals, like science, the arts, religion, or the state. The kind organizers, my dear colleagues, have paid me great honor that has deeply moved me. Obviously, I'm extremely grateful to all those who have invested much thought and great efforts to make this scholarly feast happen. At the same time, my colleagues have also offered me a great challenge, as they usually do, by making me the last speaker in this distinguished event. Will I be able to stand up to the challenge? I'm not sure, but I shall certainly try, begging you to be patient with me. And when I say patient, I mean it in more than one sense. First, in the sense of patientia, connoting patience as virtue. Patient, however, has an additional meaning, referring to the quality of endurance, that is passio. I'm afraid I shall need both your virtue and your endurance, as I shall allow myself, presupposing your patience, to talk about the big story of early modernity the way I see it in light of my historical research. But the appeal to your patience also springs from my urge to add some second-order thinking, some reflective dimension to the story I shall tell. And here I'm following in the footsteps of my dear Dr. Vater, who was also my mentor and friend, the late Yehuda Elkanah, from whom I learned both first-order thinking about facts and second-order reflecting thinking about the epistemic status of my historical endeavors. Later on, I shall even attempt to exercise some historical epistemology, a term I shamelessly borrow from Lorraine Dustin, whose friendship and wisdom I have been lucky to experience for a long, long time, including her presence here today. My story will focus on the reconfiguration of state, knowledge, religion relationships that first emerged in Europe of early modernity. In broad strokes, I shall offer a different perspective on the narrative of secularization and progress shared by many historians and social theoreticians of the period. Against the emphasis on a process of differentiation between politics, science, and religion resulting in enlightenment, I shall emphasize the emergence of a subtle system of dependencies between rulers, savants of all kinds, and religious institutions. This system of dependencies, created in the bosom of a new political order of the sovereign state, has shaped, I believe, the background to the multiple modernities, whether enlightened, violent, or both, that we are still witnessing today. My story much depends on both historical and theoretical research done in the last 30 years with the field, within the field of history of science, but also outside it, in intellectual history, political philosophy, and critical theory. While I cannot possibly account for my depths here, I still like to mention the late Professor Shmuel Eisenstadt, who invented the term multiple modernities and was another kind of spiritual guide of my work along the years. I shall be continuing my dialogue with him as I touch in the second part of my talk upon the meaning of the modern when applied to three cultural spheres. First, the Commonwealth, La République, in the process of becoming a state. Then the turn from the medieval fides to the more classical religio, which is given a new sense. And third, the theoretical disciplines, scientiae, on the way to transform into science. The historization of the three concepts, state, religion, and science, I shall argue, is crucial for understanding the modern in a nuanced way that may throw a different light on global modernity today. Thus, modernity will be presented not in terms of a universal process of differentiation and boundaries between cultural spheres, true to all societies, but rather as a possibility for new kind of negotiations across the spheres, giving birth to multiple modernities. I begin then with the sphere of politics, power and sovereignty. The new structure, they subtly transformed the relationships of prince with savant, artists, and priests in early modern Europe. Jean Bodin was one of the first moderns to ask in his Récit Livre de la République, 1576, what a state is and how it operates. The idea of the unique, unshared, and unlimited power of a sovereign first emerges in Bodin's description of the king's rule as absolute and perpetuate. I'm quoting. The sovereign is characterized as the lawmaker. Quote, a law proceeds from him who has sovereign power, and by it he binds the subject to obedience, but cannot bind himself. End of quote. This is the essence of being absolute. Before Bodin's articulation, God was conceived as the source of all laws pertaining to man and nature. God was a legislator of the law which human beings, kings, estates, jurists, scholars, had to find, to discover, to study, and to apply. God was also free to either abide by his law, his potentia ordinata, or not, meaning he could apply his potentia absoluta. But Bodin directly attributed absolute power to the sovereign, a human being assuming godly power that is analogically unbounded or seemingly unbounded. While the notion of sovereignty indeed entails the attribution of inhuman omnipotence to the ruler, it also creates a new field of dependencies between ruler and subjects, structured by the need to mediate this exact huge gap between them. And indeed, Bodin himself goes on to write that, quote, besides sovereign power, there must also be something enjoined in common. There is no commonwealth where there is no common interest, end of quote. Here we find the newly defined space common to both sovereign and subjects. In principle, it is a space governed by the same hierarchical patterns of relationships between the ruler and ruled, granting the first the right to receive obedience and imposing on the second the duty to obey. Yet the sovereign's law does not exhaust this relationship, for the absolute power of princes and sovereign lords does not extend to the laws of God and nature. The sovereign's power is thus limited by the laws of God and nature. Furthermore, a law and a covenant must not be confused. Quote, all sorts of covenants regulate public and private life in relation to the ruler. A covenant meaning, quote, a mutual undertaking between a prince and his subjects, equally binding on both parties, and neither can contravene it to the prejudice of the other without his consent. The prince has no greater privilege than the subject in this matter, end of quote. The power of kings in Bodin's text, I'm arguing, is precariously located between divine omnipotence and human fragility, revealing a desperate need for order and security while demonstrating the difficulty in actually attaining them in the here and now. It is thus marked by paradoxes and ambivalences. Yet, this paradoxical situation produced, or at least opened up, possibilities for new kind of negotiations between rulers, professionals, and religious elites. Artists, painters, and sculptors acquired the status by providing representations to glorify princes and kings. Scientists, engineers carried mechanical knowledge relevant for augmenting the ruler's physical force through the military and the economy. Priests created a dense network of religious schools that shaped generations of well-educated future elites serving the prince. Papal jurists actually invented the political system of sovereignty that legitimated absolute power. Religious orders built up churches and organized religious associations that provided the new literate publics with collective identities. Let me now turn for a moment to an example from my field of research, the discourse on motion and machines that has received the title PreClassical Mechanics by a group of scholars I admire. My colleagues and dear friends, the late Peter Damerow, Jürgen Renn, who is not here, Gideon Freudenthal, who is here, and Matteo Valeriani, who is also here. Preceding the classical mechanics of Newton that became predominant by the second half of the 17th century, the pre-classical discourse on motion and machines, including that of Galileo, Kepler, and Descartes, transformed mechanical knowledge in a long period spanning from antiquity to early modernity. Enriched by emerging technological innovations, this mechanical discourse also profited from the fruitful encounter between ancient intellectual traditions, such as the Aristotelian natural philosophy, Archimedean statics, and the sophisticated logical and mathematical skills developed within medieval mathematical traditions. It included the study of a variety of natural and artificial phenomena, such as free fall, percussion, and oscillation, using concepts such as center of gravity, local motion, acceleration, and early formulation of the concepts of momentum. It is in this framework that Galileo's new theory of motion, for example, started to emerge in a broad context that incorporated cosmological and astronomical issues, as well as a theory of matter. Pre-classical mechanics, anchored in a feedback loop between knowledge of practitioners and theoretical reflection on that knowledge, was first carried by a new class of engineer scientists, many of them Italian, as I've learned from my colleague Valeriani, who is here, from his wonderful book on Galileo and Leer. It was diffused in various sites around Europe and beyond, including building sites, workshops and arsenals, universities, Jesuit colleges, academies, and courts. Some of these, such as universities, were traditional centers of knowledge production and diffusion, which nonetheless underwent transformations in the early modern era. Others, such as the academies, were new types of loose, incoherent institutional structures. Yet others, such as the court or the arsenal, were for the most part not conceived as sites of knowledge at all by traditional historiography of science, yet came to assume importance in more recent studies like Valeriani, as I said, and like Biagioli. 2 points in this quick description are crucial in my story of the new system of mutual dependencies between sovereign powers, the sciences and the arts, and the new forms of Christian religion. On the institutional level, it is important to remember that most of the new knowledge sites existed under the patronage of sovereign rulers. Even old universities, such as the one in Pisa, became state universities, thereby losing actually many of the traditional privileges that had previously guaranteed them some degree of autonomy. Pre-classical mechanics was mostly carried out in these locations. Galileo's new theory of motion, for example, was highly dependent on what he learned at the Venetian arsenal, while his new astronomy grew at the Medici court in Florence. This was the rule, I say, rather than the exception, and it applied to the system of religious education as well. No less relevant from the intellectual point of view, the broad framework of pre-classical mechanics is an outstanding example of an intellectual framework capable of incorporating ancient and modern elements, and thus open either to radical interpretations like Galileo's or to traditional ones like those of the Jesuits. Thus, for example, Galileo's discourse on buoyancy and his law of free fall, or Kepler's camera obscura, seen not only by the authors but also by post-Newtonians and historians of the scientific revolution as radically innovative, were in fact quite easily incorporated into the traditional Catholic education system. Jesuits in particular played a major role in inventing sophisticated mechanisms of inclusion and control that allowed for maintaining the Tridentine worldview while adapting innovations in order to present them as somehow related to the tradition. Many denounced the Jesuits for their techniques of fusing the new into the old in non-conventional ways. They were blamed for hypocrisy and accused for their duplicity. Others preferred the term dissimulazione onesta to account for their accommodation strategies. Yet they well represented the option of taking part in the modernity of that time and even shaping it while still remaining faithful to the Orthodox Christian tradition and to the old cosmological worldview. So I'm now coming to my concluding reflections on the significance of all this to our understanding of modernity. The concept of multiple modernities was first introduced by Eisenstadt as a correction to classical sociological theories of modernization. Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, who theorized these concepts, posited a coherent, linear process in all societies leading to a Western model of modernity. Eisenstadt, on his part, insisted on a process ridden by antinomies that led either to enlightenment, democracy, and secularization, or to an ideology of violence, terror, and war. The narrative I presented here, in a nutshell, shows the fragility of such processes. For example, the fragility of the boundary between Galileo as courtier, in my example, and Galileo as engineer or scientist. Likewise, my research shows that it is impossible to separate between Jesuit teachers of science, Jesuit priests, and Jesuit political theorists. What this suggests, I argue, is that once we start to seriously historicize the meta-categories of the modern outlook, like state, science, and religion, then the grand narratives of secularization, progress, and enlightenment prove to be far more messy and complex. For a long time, we seem to take for granted the modern political order in terms of sovereign states that are also democratic and liberal. We understood science to be meritocratic, democratic, and enriched by both technology and the humanistic disciplines. We also tended to undervalue the vitality and attraction of religion in the modern age. Our beliefs or our prejudices, depending on the position of the speaker, were partly shaped by the predominant narrative of the enlightened West and its eternal conflict with religion. It is a narrative worth questioning today, not in order to destroy it, but in order to point out historically the dialectical nature of modernity. Modernity is always that precarious and tense moment between the past and the future. It's not a substance. We are faced today with the reality of economically successful neoliberal sovereign states that are neither democratic nor liberal, with a new kind of scientism that tends to undermine the philosophical and humanistic background of the arts and sciences that we inherited from our pre-modern history. And we seem to be overwhelmed by the resurgence of militant religious movements, whether Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Facing all this, we simply cannot afford to ignore the history that has constituted our worldviews in quest for a new narrative and a vision for the future. So in a few words now, I would like to thank the people, all distinguished scholars, who have been involved in this event. Our guests from abroad, Rainy Daston, my model for a scholar for many years, Moritz Eppele, from whom I learned about historization in the study of science, Matteo Valeriani, who has taught me the importance of practical knowledge for the development of science, Galen, and Martin, friends of Minerva Center of the Humanities and partners to some of its projects, Gabriel Motzkin, I'm sorry he's not here, an old friend, a fellow historian and philosopher, director of the Van Leer Institute, who has collaborated on many of our projects, including this one, inviting us to enjoy the spaces of this place of knowledge. Leo Coy and Jose Brunner, Yossi Mali, Menachem Fish, and Shaul Katzir, all of whom were partners to scholarship, to research projects, and academic administration, working together at the Cohen Institute and the Faculty of the Humanities in Tel Aviv. Ohad Parnes, a category of his own, a scholar and administrator moving between Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Berlin. Ora Limor, a soulmate and inspiring medievalist, Yemima Ben Menachem, whose clarity of thought I can only envy. Julia Lerner, the active sociological motor of the project on Russians in Israel. My once upon a time students who have become distinguished professors and researchers dispersed in the four corners of the world and in Israeli universities, Amnon Ras-Krakotskin, Ofer Gal, Ras Chen Moritz, Hanan Yoran, Itai Sapir, Miki Elazar, and Roni Mirkin. My present bright doctoral students, Dikla Beitner and Naomi Yuval Naeh, and most important for the life of the Minerva Humanities Center, the unsurpassable team, who are not only scholars in their own right, but also perfect organizers. Gal Hertz, Yuli Litov, Nave Fomer, Yael Atia, and of course, Shaul Katzir again, who planned all this together with Gal. And finally, Mota, from whom I learned the meaning of true patience, generosity, and partaking in the life of another. And to our children, Eran and Inat, Michal and Tomer, Guy and Adva, Yuval and Michal, for just being who they are, to all of you. And to the audience who took part in the session and discussions. Big thank you.
Well, Rivka, are you ready? You want to take some questions? I think we have 10 or 15 minutes to this exemplary talk by Rivka, not the first and surely not the last we will hear. So the floor is open for questions. Please, Professor Nasser.
Rivka, thank you very much. My question concerns what happened with the Catholic countries. So there is a cherished Protestant mythology which produces lots of turgid 19th century works called Martyrs of Science about how Catholicism is simply immiscible with modern science. Neither you nor I, nor probably anyone in this room believes that. On the other hand, it's clear from what you said that the Catholic countries had all of the ingredients that you posit for this new mix, this new alliance of the state, religion, and science. They had absolute princes. They created the model for what it meant to have an absolute court. They created the model for the best universities of the 16th century. I need only say Padua. The Jesuits, the Ratio Studiorum, as you know far better than I, show how compatible the elements which are considered most characteristic of the new science, both mathematics and experiment, were part of this mix. And yet, I think one has to say by the mid-18th century, it's northern Western Europe which has decisively become the center of gravity for these activities. What is the missing ingredient here?
Okay. Collect.
You prefer to collect the questions?
No, I shall answer. So that's exactly the point. There is no one thing. Okay. Definitely, I think that we cannot believe anymore in the myth of the Protestant ethics as the precursor of modernity and then leading to modernity. Definitely, there were, as I try to point out, science was always connected with all sorts of economic enterprises. This relationship was assumed different forms in Catholic and Southern European countries and the North. The economic center migrates actually to the North. We have to investigate much more the socioeconomic background of science and its relationship to economics to understand this. French Revolution, definitely somehow is related, and all those thinkers we were hearing about today, the 18th century, about whom you know much better than I do, all these kind of things propose different ways of modernity, whether it was revolution in France, it's not the north of Europe, it's a very Catholic world, state, and it's the symbol of enlightenment and modernity. So I don't think there is one ingredient that is missing. I think we have to look carefully into the negotiations between these spheres in order to suggest a new grand narrative, whether we want it. Perhaps we don't want it, and we would like more to see the details and the migration and the types of negotiations, and not just characterize, the north of Europe as Protestant and the south of Europe as Catholic. One is progressive and the other is somehow backwards. That would be my answer. It's not an ultimate big narrative, a second big narrative.
Rivka, I want to push you a little on the notion of modernity itself, because as I think you know, I agree completely with the notion that the crucial turning point, and if Rainey will allow me the use of the phrase of a framework transition, a major frame, is that moment of hybridic dithering. And the work on PreClassical Mechanics is classical in that sense of the term. But there are other examples, like the mathematicians of the early 19th century in England I work on, and so on and so forth. Now, that would be a framework transition, but not the birth. Even if you talk about multiple modernities, this isn't the birth of modernity in Cambridge, UK, right? I mean, this is a symptom of the transition of a set of commitments, but not a transition into modernity per se. I mean, I'd even be willing to argue that would be a symptom of the transition out of modernity as well, and of any kind of a major transition of normative commitment. So what makes the moment you're talking about a moment of modernity and not merely, if that's the word, a major framework transition as such?
That's modernity in my mind. Modernity is exactly this moment of hybridity when you don't know what will be the future in relation to the past. You don't even know the past in some sense, because you have not yet told a continuation between the past and the future. Modernity is exactly being in between the past and the future. And it's not a substance, not an essence, not a kind of a big ideology in my mind. That's modernity. And therefore, I think we are in another moment of modernity now. And I don't call it post-modernity. I call it modernity. That's exactly my definition of modernity.
More questions?
If I may continue, precisely at that point, why can't we dispense with the notion of modernity then, after all? If it's just a moment between a very complex past and a probably equally complex future, and if there are many, many moments, many different locations, and so why do we need this unifying notion of modernity at all? Wouldn't it be an intellectual option to just dispense with it?
You know,
What would
it's
be
the
your
eternal question of continuity and discrete. You know, we need for our human temporality to define in our mind, you know, what is it really that is between the past and the future? And I want to point out to this need, exactly to this moment of transition. And from there, you know, there's a way to my conception of migrating knowledge. I will not elaborate on it now, and the way I am doing history. But I would insist that between the past and the future, for our temporality, we need this in-betweenness. And, you know, I can speak a lot about it, but not now, not here.
So just let me continue. Modernity is just the present, or there's something that
you know, the moderni were first came first alive in the Middle Ages. The modernity was those people who came after the Thomistic synthesis and criticized it. And, you know, we can talk a lot about what they did, as we did in our lectures. But they called themselves moderni. And we still call ourselves moderni, or at least 50 years ago, people still thought they are moderni. So, you know, this is another kind of indication that we should rethink the very term modernity. Yes.
Offer, please. Offer.
Are we now postmodern? I mean,
Postmodernism is modern. I have a series of essays which I wrote in 93, I think, in Davar, which was the main daily in Israel associated with the Labour Party. And they had a very, very good literary supplement. And I published 2 articles. One was about modernity, and one was postmodern is modern. And so, you know, I can elaborate on that too, but I think that's exactly what I mean. We're
still there. The moment still.
We're still in the same moment that started around Galileo, around the
in the
Galileo
14th century. In the 14th century, the Via Moderna.
No, we're not there. We are conceptualizing our temporality in terms of past and future and a moment of in-between. And that's present somehow.
Matteo, and then one last question.
The period you consider is the same period during which the technological leadership moved from South Europe to Northern Europe.
I'm getting a little bit back to the first question. But there is not only a geographic shift, there is also an increase in investment and relevance of technology, mostly for military reasons, unfortunately, but not only. Urbanization processes are also going on. So how this exactly fit in the evolution that you are describing? This shift of the leadership away from Rome, eventually, more far away. How this is framed?
Well, you know, you have to tell the story of the kind of state that France and England became at that period. And obviously, I think the crucial moment here is the economic, military, state framework. And on that background, you have to tell the story of science and religion. But in terms of organization, it's the new, and it's not only a new entity, the sovereign state. It's a new conception of politics. And that I learned from my friend Adi, who is not here now. But for the first time, you can, it's his conceptualization. For the first time, you can separate between a particular power, you know, which is the Shilton, how should I? Shilton?
Government.
The government, let's say, and the political. Okay? It's a new type of political organization. And I would explain this by referring to the development of the French and English and Dutch states, and you know, and the way they incorporated, or the way the negotiations went on between scientists, engineers, artists, savants of all kinds, and eventually scientists, and the religious leadership.
One last question, if we have, please.
So modernity is kind of an interface between what? Between the economical military state and some other form of organization?
No, modernity is a mode of our temporality. You know, it relates to our conceptualization of time and the way we posit ourselves in time. And I did not give it a positive content. Okay, I just, you know, and I try to say that there are these crucial moments when people perceive themselves as moderns. And that is the discussion about modernity. And the discussion we had here was about the contents in the different periods.
So it's a self-perception.
It's an organization. It's a type of organization of time. Yes, by agents.
Okay, let us thank Rivka again for this talk and for all the others.